When we used the new keyword in that last example, what we were really doing was invoking a special method on our class known as a constructor. We didn't have to explicitly write a constructor for our class. There was one provided for us by default, but there are many cases where you will want to write a constructor. A constructor is where you can set up the default values for your object. In some scenarios, you might even write multiple constructors. This will allow people to use the constructor that best fits their scenario and instantiate the object and have it initialized appropriately for how they want to use it. When you write multiple constructors, each constructor method must take different types of arguments or a different number of arguments for the C# compiler to be able to figure out which constructor to call. The snippet of code that is on this slide is defining a constructor for the employee class. I know this is a constructor for two reasons. First of all, a constructor never specifies a return type. Any other method that you write on a class has to specify that it returns an int or a string or some type, or you can use the void keyword just to specify that the method doesn't return anything. But a constructor never has any type information, never has a void keyword here. The other way that I can tell this is a constructor is because it exactly matches the name of the class. The class name is employee, this method name is employee. I know it's a constructor. And what it's going to do is simply set up the state, the properties and fields that are in this object to some default values. Name equals empty and salaried equals false is what the client's going to see after they construct an object of type employee. With that in mind, let's switch over into the demo application, and I want to make a quick change here. First of all, where is this code? What sort of method is it in? It's in the constructor for the main window that pops up on the screen. Now, generally speaking, you don't want to perform any work inside of the constructor of a WPF window or WPF control. The constructor is really where it needs to initialize itself and get itself ready to display on the screen. After everything's been initialized, it's been loaded up, and it's on the screen, you'll get an event that signifies that everything is ready, and you can hook into that event and execute some code. We're going to be talking about events in more detail later in this course, but for now, just trust me that main window underscore loaded is an event handler. This method will be invoked by WPF once the window is on the screen and everything is ready to go. And it's inside of there where we're going to execute our code and change the display of the output text block. The other small change that I'm going to make is that instead of displaying the name of each employee, I'm going to display the length of their name. And if I run this application by pressing F5, we get 5 and 6, which is the values that we expected. But let's see what happens if I comment out this line of code that's initializing the name field for E2. Now I'm going to run the application again by pressing F5, and we're going to get a runtime error. We're going to get an exception that tells me that I did something wrong, and it brings the application to a halt. It's a null reference exception, which generally happens when you try to do something with a variable that is not pointing to a valid object. It's null. Perhaps it hasn't been initialized. And that's exactly what happened here. If we look in the autos window that the debugger gives us, we can see that e2.name has a null value. It's not pointing to an actual string. Thus, when we try to get the length of something that doesn't exist, the CLR gives up and throws an exception and says, you've done something that's illegal. Something must be wrong in your program. The question is, why is name null? Well, it was never initialized. The employee class doesn't have a constructor. Well, it does. It actually has an implicit default constructor. But what that implicit default constructor does is just initialize everything in the object to the default values. And the default value for a string and other reference types is going to be a null value. The default value for an integer and doubles and floats and things like that will be a 0 value. But for strings, it's null, and that prevents us from getting a length amount. So a null value might surprise someone who's using my class. They might think that we initialize everything to some sensible value. So the way we could fix this is to actually provide a constructor for employee. And I'm going to type CTOR, which will activate a code snippet in Visual Studio. And then if I hit tab and tab again, it's like a macro that will automatically expand into constructor code for me. So I don't have to type public employee parenthesis and opening brace and so forth. Inside of here, I'm going to initialize name to an empty string. So essentially what we had before was an implicit default constructor that just did this, set name to null. I'm going to change it so that name is an empty string and press F5 to run the application again, and you'll see that we get 5 and 0. The length of an empty string is 0. Now just so you know, there's another way I could have achieved this, and that is that when you have a field in a class, you can provide an initializer for it. So this is essentially doing the same thing. When this object is constructed, any code that you have in this on the right-hand side here is going to execute. So this is essentially going to assign an empty string to name, and that code would also work. Now what we've written here is known as a default constructor, and it's a default constructor because it doesn't take any arguments. I can use it with the new operator and not pass any parameters in. However, let's comment this out, and let's write another constructor, but this one, we're going to ask the user to pass in a name when they're constructing an employee. And what we'll do is we'll take this name parameter that gets passed in and we'll just assign it into the field. As soon as you provide a constructor that is not a default constructor, it takes some parameter, you no longer have this implicit default constructor as part of the class. So code that is invoking new employee and not passing in a method, passing in a parameter, that's not going to work anymore. This becomes a compiler error, and I am forced to pass something in as a parameter. That would fix one error, but we still have a problem here. It is possible, though, to have multiple versions, multiple constructors. So here's a default constructor that doesn't take any parameters. Here's a constructor that takes a name parameter. And that will work. That will let things work again. And let's just run the application, and we get a 5 and a 4, which is correct for the way we have things set up now. This is an example of overloading in C#. You can overload methods, and when you're overloading, what you're doing is you're providing multiple implementations of a method. They all have the same name, but they take different parameter types or a different number of parameters. In other words, it is an error if I tried to write a second constructor that took a string parameter. Even if I was using it to initialize a different field, this will make the C# compiler unhappy. And that should make sense, because when you're reading this line of code here, new employee pass in a Paul, well, which constructor should it be invoking? The first one or the second one? It would be completely legal, though, to have a different parameter type here, like int, because then the C# compiler can differentiate between these two constructors. This is going to call the one that takes a string. And this is true anytime you write methods, you can overload them in this way. But we're not using this constructor, so let's get rid of it. And I'm also going to remove this initializer because we want to provide a default constructor, and inside of here we can just make sure that name is always initialized to at least an empty string. That way anyone who is using our class should never see a null value for this name field unless they explicitly assign it themselves.